On March 25th, 2021, Governor Ralph Northam formally abolished Virginia's death penalty. Now, this may just seem like a simple statement of fact to most of us. The death penalty has been relegated sometimes only as abstract theory, a lingering remnant of a previous generation, rarely applied and almost never discussed in polite Virginia society. But this was more. The death penalty abolition is more than just a simple statement. This was a landmark achievement, and I am proud to have played a role in it. Virginia became the first Southern state to abolish the death penalty, and we did it through education and a simple change of messaging. Now, here's a history lesson you've probably never heard before. Over 413 years, Virginia executed 1,390 people. That's more than any other state. That's more than Texas. We started executing in 1608, 1 year after the founding of Jamestown. And except for one 20-year moratorium from 1962 to 1982, we never stopped. We executed 94 women, far more than any other state. We executed more children who were verified to be between 11 and 17 years of age. And most shamefully, we executed about 736 enslaved people. That accounts for 87% of all enslaved executions nationwide. In addition to these staggering numbers, Virginia also streamlined the execution process, making the journey from the courtroom to the gallows, to the electric chair, to the lethal injection gurney faster than any other state. After 1975, we perfected what was called the rocket docket, in which primarily young men would be tried, convicted, and executed in just under 5 years. That's more than twice as fast as runner-up Delaware at 12 years. Death, it seemed, was the Virginia way. It was well known and generally accepted that the death penalty was racially biased. Between 1908 and 1962, for example, Virginia executed 236 people in the electric chair in the old state penitentiary in Richmond. Of those 236, 200 were black men. One was a black woman, a 17-year-old named Virginia Christian. The racial bias was so bad that in 1972, the Supreme Court actually declared the death penalty unconstitutional nationwide. But in 1976, the court came back and told the 36 death penalty states, including Virginia, that they could resume executions as long as certain mandates were followed to ensure that race no longer played a significant role in the execution process. Armed with these court-ordered mandates, Virginia's machinery of death emphasized finality over fairness. Virginia's draconian laws prevented defense attorneys from representing death-sentenced prisoners, leaving them to navigate the complex appeals process on their own. Virginia's 21-day rule prevented the introduction of new evidence in a case after 21 days post-conviction. Someone could literally confess to the crime that you were about to be sentenced to death for on day 22, and it would be inadmissible. Virginia shrouded the death penalty process in secrecy to both protect the government from oversight and to hide it from public view. The executioner and his team were unknown. Execution, lethal injection drugs were purchased clandestinely for wildly inflated prices from out-of-state secret pharmacies and then brought into Virginia illegally by bypassing the Board of Pharmacy. And finally, when the appeals were exhausted and execution appeared imminent, Virginia incinerated the evidence so that it could never be studied again. In the early to mid-1970s, when the General Assembly was gearing back up to restart executions, a small group of people began to voice opposition. Calling themselves Virginians Against the Death Penalty, they sought to educate the public about the problems with the death penalty. But for many years, they made little to no progress. When confronted with a death penalty supporter, they would say, "I am against the death penalty." Whereas the other person would say, "Well, I'm for the death penalty." And that's about as far as it went. There was no progress made. This, you can imagine, was a problem. But in the early 1990s, that subtle shift in messaging dramatically transformed the landscape. Now, when confronted with a death penalty supporter who said, "I am for the death penalty," we would say, "Well, I am for alternatives to the death penalty." And the next question would invariably be, what are your alternatives? You see what happened? Instead of being against something, we were for something. And that subtle shift sparked the conversation. And Virginians Against the Death Penalty rebranded itself as Virginians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. Now, instead of butting heads and getting nowhere, we could spark that conversation. We had an opportunity to discuss the cost overruns of the capital punishment system. We had an opportunity to discuss the documented lack of deterrence. Most importantly, we had an opportunity to talk about the possibility of executing an innocent person. And that's a very real possibility, by the way. 1 in 8 death row inmates nationwide since 1973 have been discovered to be completely innocent of the crime for which they were sentenced to death. 1 in 8. And those are the ones that were caught. That's an appalling failure rate. What were our alternatives to the death penalty? Well, that's ultimately up to a jury. But usually, generally, it's a life sentence. We just wanted to take state-sanctioned death off the table. If later on they are found to be innocent, they can be released from prison. They cannot, however, they cannot be released from the grave. What happened? So what changed in Virginia to force us to abandon this long legacy of death? Well, in addition to education and better messaging, superior capital defense attorneys worked hard to ensure that prosecutors would not bring a death sentence at the trial stage. Murder victim family members and Commonwealth's attorneys, representing almost half of Virginia's population, all signed on to abolish the death penalty. National coalitions joined us, offering tools and resources, including targeted polling in jurisdictions where the legislator may have been on the fence. And finally, in his 2021 State of the Commonwealth address, Governor Northam spoke clearly and unambiguously of his desire to abolish the death penalty. And then, about a month later, the General Assembly, in a symbolic gesture to the entire former Confederacy, voted in a bipartisan manner to do just that. Virginia is now seen as the gateway to abolition for the rest of the American South and across the entire nation. Look, for over 400 years, the death penalty cast a long and dark shadow over the Old Dominion with its abdication of fairness. And it can come back. Let me say that again. It can come back. However, through continuing education, spot-on messaging, we all can ensure that the wretched inefficiencies of this tragic relic of the past remains buried out of sight where it belongs. Thank you.